figured out. I was gonna put it right against my laptop, but my laptop's freaking out now.
Oh no. That was the hardest part of this morning was like,
Yes.
where am I going to put my phone?
Whew.
Ah, got
Okay.
it sorted.
It looks like it's 10 a.m. and I'm assuming that people are going to trickle in. So I was thinking we could just spend these first couple of minutes introducing ourselves, talking about our work with our respective organizations. So I can go ahead and go first. My name is Diana Fu. I'm a environmental planner over at the San Francisco Estuary Partnership. And basically what the partnership does is we manage important multi-benefit projects all over the San Francisco Bay Area and the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. And we build partnerships and leverage federal funding because we are a national estuary program. We're part of a network, a national network of NEPs. So we leverage federal funding and state and local funds for regional scale restoration, water quality improvement, and resilience building projects. And Stephanie, if you would like to introduce yourself, now's
Sure, thanks. Well, first of all, thanks so much for having me on today, Diana. I'm really excited to be here. My name is Stephanie Panlasigui, and I am an environmental scientist at the San Francisco Estuary Institute. We are a nonprofit science research organization that's based in Richmond, and we are focused on finding innovative solutions to a variety of environmental issues, both in San Francisco Bay and beyond as well. And I work on the Resilient Landscapes program, which we're focused on mostly on nature-based solutions to climate adaptation.
awesome. So resilient landscapes, that sounds like something that addresses climate change. Would you like to talk a
Absolutely.
bit more about that?
Sure, yes. So on the Resilient Landscapes team at SFEI, we spend a lot of time thinking about how do we go about restoring our ecosystems and how do we reintegrate nature into our cities. Um, this these actions would help us to support healthy people, healthy wildlife, and healthy ecosystems so that we continue to have the functions that we need to survive as the climate continues to change. So things like making sure that food continues to be produced and we still have water and it's clean quality water for our drinking water. Um, we also look at things like how planting trees in our cities will help us to stay cool as we move about them as the temperatures continue to rise. We also take a look at how having nature around us, just simply being able to interact with it, can help us with our physical and our mental health.
Wow, so there's a lot of work that goes on in the resilient landscapes
A whole lot.
or project. Is there anything out of, or all of them, out of all of like kind of like the tasks and the subject areas that you mentioned, are there any that you spoke that you focus on specifically?
Yes, so I personally spend most of my time working on urban ecology, so looking at that aspect of reintegrating nature into our cities, looking at where to plant trees and other kinds of vegetation, and looking into scientific research about which local wildlife will those actions support. So it's really exciting work, and I'm sure you'll see some of it around the Bay Area, whether you know it or not.
Is there specific wildlife that you're looking to support at this moment, or is it a whole bunch of different species, flora and fauna and whatnot?
It's a whole bunch. So we are trying to support every aspect of local biodiversity, but we do make an effort to highlight certain focal species in our projects so that it's a little bit more tangible than just saying all local wildlife. So a good way to do that is often to select a number of bird species. People tend to really love birds, and birds are really charismatic and draw people into conservation efforts.
that makes sense.
Mhm.
Um, I kind of want to dive a little bit deeper into what you were talking about at the beginning when you're introducing yourself. You
Mhm.
mentioned something called nature-based solutions. Do you think you can kind of break that down for everyone who's watching? Like, what exactly is a nature-based solution, and how is that different from something that's just like a natural landscape?
Right. So we tend to use the words nature-based solutions often in the urban environment, but other places as well. Um, this is focusing on using the power that really is already inherent in our natural landscapes to fix some of the challenges that we see today. So, for example, there are a lot of places where cities have actually been built on what used to be rivers or wetlands, and those were drained. But we have kind of forgotten about that since time has passed since those buildings were put up. And now we see that those places tend to flood a lot. So, a nature based solution for that would be to install some green infrastructure, which means like creating an area where there's vegetation, where the water can go, so that it instead of flooding your homes, it's flooding in this designated area. So that's one example, but really it's to make sure that we have nature around us that's providing the functions that will keep us safe and healthy.
Yeah, so it sounds like something like green infrastructure does a lot of things for folks and their neighborhood. So you mentioned flooding. I would also imagine that having more greenery in urban areas makes it like kind of like more moderate in temperature. Is that right?
It does. There's this phenomenon called the urban heat island effect, where in places where cities have been built, there's a lot more cement and things that absorb the heat from the sun. And that makes our cities much more hot that relative to a natural area that is maybe just adjacent to your city. So in that urban heat island effect, if you were to plant more trees on your street, it would help to mitigate those temperatures, providing some shade, providing some cooling, and yeah, keeping the sun off of you so that you can bike or walk to work and school.
And does SFEI do like specific studies about like how effective that is, or has that kind of body of work already been established and people already know it's something that definitely helps with the urban heat island effect?
Right. There's been a whole lot of research done in general about the urban heat island. We've been fortunate to do a little bit of modeling to when once we have a specific project site, then we can look at more on a micro scale of is the side of the sidewalk the hotter side or the other side of the street. Yeah, so there's a whole lot of science that's out there already, and we're using that in our projects.
Cool. Awesome.
Mhm.
Next, actually, for everyone who's watching, I just wanted to acknowledge this is called Ask a Scientist. And if folks have any questions, please send them to us in the little chat box. Feel free to interact with us. I just wanted to let folks know that this is meant to be interactive, and we will be answering audience questions that we're getting from Twitter or Facebook. I have staff on hand to help me out today to kind of ask those additional audience questions. Um, so now that I have that established, I forgot to mention that in the beginning.
It's okay. There's more people here now.
Exactly, exactly. So Stephanie, I mean, it seems like you're doing, I mean, not seems, like I know you are doing really important work. And I also wanted to kind of like take a moment just to like step back and ask, what are some of the biggest challenges of your work and kind of
Yeah.
how to address those challenges?
Right. There's challenges to any kind of work, right? But I think that one of the biggest challenges can also lead to some of the biggest rewards. I think one of the things that SFEI does really well is to bring people together uh, who otherwise maybe wouldn't have spoken to each other to have a conversation about what's going on, what's their perspective, and what are maybe some solutions to the issues that they're seeing in the places that they live and work. And we do that in a few different ways. So we do stakeholder engagement meetings. We're involved in a lot of regional coordination. So there's working group meetings as well. And then for project-specific questions, we tend to assemble groups of experts to make sure that the science that we're doing is rigorous and that we're getting the right results and interpretation out of it. So there's a lot that goes into vetting those ideas. So I think that bringing people together with a lot of different perspectives and areas of expertise gets us to a place that's a lot stronger, where our products are better than they otherwise would have been, and hopefully more useful for folks.
Yeah. Along those lines, I mean, you're talking about SFEI really being the scientific resource and this like scientific powerhouse for all of the other kind of projects and actual implementation that's going on, as well as the planning. A lot of what SFEP does actually relies on SFEI's work, which is we can't really, plan or implement a project if it's not backed by good science, right? Um,
Absolutely.
I'm wondering, SFEI has this kind of like keystone um, role in everything that's going on in restoration work in the estuary. And is there ever kind of like a challenge communicating those ideas to your stakeholders? Or is everyone, I'm not exactly sure who comes to the SFEI table. I know who comes to the SFEP table, but I know that there's been a push, more recently to make science more accessible, more digestible. And how do you balance that kind of like keeping the rigor of your scientific research and your tools and your knowledge, but also balancing it with bringing all of these different stakeholders to the table?
Hmm. Yeah, that's a really good point, Diana. It is a balance because you don't want to lose some of the nuance that is in the scientific research and in the studies that we are trying to base these kinds of decisions on. Um, but I think that there's definitely a way to do it. There's a good way to be able to communicate that information. It is really a very important skill set for a lot of scientists to have. I mean, really everyone, but I think scientists really need to have communication skills. There's a tendency, I think, to be much more academic, and even these, journal articles are very hard to read. They're not exciting, but they could be. And I think that you can publish your academic journal article, and then you can also create a more generalized public version and put it out there so that people really do understand. And I don't think it's necessarily losing a lot of information. It's just phrasing it in a different way so that people can understand and get on board too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, I want to go back to a little bit about your work.
Hmm.
How do you think climate change is going to impact kind of the areas that you're working in or the projects that you're working on for like the next, I don't know, it's hard to predict, right? It's so certain, but
Right.
are there things that you're anticipating and proactively addressing in your work? Is that most of your work? Is that some of your work?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So, as I'm sure everyone on this call knows, climate change is going to be touching almost every aspect of our lives. And living here in the Bay Area in California, we're really affected by fires and the smoke that is just making our air quality really poor for like 3 months out of every year now. Um, we're really, since I do mostly focus on urban areas, I'll just mostly speak to that. We're really, one of the things that I spend more time on is this idea of of urban heat islands, of adding trees and other vegetation to make sure that our cities stay a bit cooler, more comfortable for people to move around. And also, as we have developed across the landscape, there's been less and less habitat available for wildlife too. The wildlife as well is susceptible to the changes from a changing climate. So it's great that we have all kinds of big open spaces, but cities also have a role to play in biodiversity conservation. So I'm trying to, there's something that we use called the Urban Biodiversity Framework that helps us to, we published this report in 2019, and it outlines 7 different ways that we can improve the quantity as well as the quality of habitat in cities so that wildlife can continue to persist here as well.
I love how you said that urban areas and cities also have a role to play in conservation and biodiversity, because I feel like many people, when they think about nature or conservation or biodiversity, they're thinking of these, kind of like far off, pristine, whatever that means, like rural areas, when really there is a lot going on in terms of ecology in their own backyard. Are there
Yes.
any specific places in the Bay Area that that already have green infrastructure? I know there's projects in I think the city of Palo Alto actually has an incentive program for building green infrastructure, or they call them rain gardens because it's a little bit more intuitive to lay people, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
But are there any specific areas that you're looking at? Any cities in particular?
Um, I would say my projects are a little bit more generalized than having specific sites around the Bay Area right now. But I do know that I live in Oakland, and really close to me there is a really nice greenway in Emeryville that has some native plants. There's even some educational signs that describe what it means to capture our stormwater. So you're providing this space again for water to run to, so that it's not running into your home, it's running into this garden, like you're saying. I think that's really awesome because it's a place where people can be physically active and also interact with nature, and yeah, be using their own feet and bicycles rather than sticking with cars. Yeah.
Totally. Um, I asked this question to everyone who's come through to Ask a Scientist, but
Uh-huh.
it was kind of a canned question. But do you have hope for the future of the Bay Area and its ability to adapt to climate change?
Yes, yes,
Okay.
yes.
Is
I
there time
do.
to that?
Yeah, well, so I think the Bay Area has always been a place for people who are really hopeful. You can see throughout our history just a number of movements where people wanted to create change for a better future. So I think that the Bay Area is going to be one of those places that really leads the way for the rest of the country. And when we have hope, we can take action. And then when we see progress that comes from those actions that we've taken, then that really fuels continued hope or more hope. So I hope everybody will hold on to theirs and take some actions, because we do need individual action as well as bigger systemic changes. And there's also, I think it's last month now that it's October, there was a big package of legislation that was signed by our governor just a couple weeks ago, I think. And so there are some major investments in climate resilience, climate action coming to our state. So it's really something to look forward to and keep an eye on.
Yeah, and I love that you mentioned, kind of looking back into history, and seeing kind of this like demonstrated impact, collective impact of individuals that cared about the estuary or cared about the bay, right? Like there's these historic organizations like Save the Bay. The bay used to be super polluted and it was somewhere where people didn't want to live near, but now we have a whole bay trail, right? We have whole spaces that are dedicated to connecting to the bay or the estuary. So I love that you
Mm-hmm.
brought that up. And hopefully that leaves people with some tangible hope for what's coming down the line, even though we're facing new threats, or increasing threats of climate change.
Mm-hmm.
um, at this point, I wanted to address some of the audience questions, and I can see that someone has entered one into the IG live chat here, so I'm just going to read it
Mm-hmm.
out loud. um, can you explore how SFEI and other regional partners are tackling gentrification resulting from environmental projects implemented in urban settings?
That's a great question, and it's super important because, as I'm sure this person knows, and gentrification is a huge problem in the Bay Area. Housing in general is a huge problem here. And there is something that is called green gentrification, which I think this person is alluding to, where in an area where it was deemed less desirable, it may have less green space, it may have fewer trees in the neighborhood. So when you do add the trees, it accelerates gentrification of that area. So it's something that we're very much aware of. We are looking at it in several of our projects where we're in urban settings. There's one research project going on right now where we're looking at not just where and how to add more nature to our neighborhoods, but then what are the health benefits that come from this. And we are definitely taking a look into gentrification as a trade-off for your health. It induces stress, it induces fear of getting displaced from the neighborhood that you've lived in for a really long time. And I mentioned earlier that we recruit we recruit experts in those other fields to contribute to these projects. And we're working closely with a couple other researchers who specialize in this area of study that's really quite new, of trying to figure out what are the conditions where adding nature will spur gentrification and how do we avoid it. And a lot of that is up to local policy to help with affordable housing, working with community land trusts to make sure that there's still affordable housing in the area. There's several things. It's a really great question. Thank you for bringing it up.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, in the environmental field, like historically, if we're going back in history, right, like there's a lot of great work that has been done, to move the needle in the right direction. But
Mm-hmm.
there's also been kind of this historic, I wouldn't say like, well, yeah, I mean, historic disregard for, communities of color, um,
Mm-hmm.
marginalized communities, immigrant communities. And you know, historic redlining has often put neighborhoods in places where they are near, sources of pollution. Back when
Mm-hmm.
our cities were super industrial, and there was a lot of, manufacturing and industry going on, especially, in a place like the Bay Area where it's a highly industrialized waterfront, especially in Oakland, in San Francisco, in Richmond, and the communities that live near there have to deal with that. And
Mm-hmm.
now that we're seeing kind of this shift in American cities to become, less industrialized, everything's becoming more and more focused on kind of the information and technology sector, right? Things are Manufacturing is not really in our cities anymore. And now there's this question of how do we revitalize, how do we clean up these former industrial sites that have maybe a lot of legacy pollutants. And then in turn, we need to be thinking about, okay, well, after we clean up this space, who still gets to enjoy it? Is it going to be the
Hmm.
community that has been living there, because of past systemic decisions? Or, is it going to be kind of like you know, people people who want to live somewhere nice? It's market forces that's going on.
Hmm.
So
Right.
I think it's something recently that a lot of environmental groups, agencies are acknowledging. We can't make environmental decisions without thinking about people in communities as well. And that's something that
Hmm.
the San Francisco Estuary Partnership is also actively thinking about. This kind of leads me to a nice little closer. I was just going to mention our estuary blueprint. This year, we are updating the estuary blueprint, which is basically our roadmap to a healthier, um, uh, better estuary, I guess, by 2050, and it outlines the steps that we need to take to make that happen. Um, with this new update, we're adding a new action that's centered around equity, and how can we ensure that the voices of people from marginalized communities can voice their concerns? How can they, say yes or no to certain projects that are happening in their neighborhood? How can they contribute to kind of this long-term planning of not only environmental restoration, but also their livelihoods, right? Their neighborhoods and their communities and what that looks like. So yeah, I wanted to thank Jamishly underscore happy for that question, because I think it's super important, and it's something that's definitely at the top of many environmental practitioners, scientists, planners' minds. Um, with that, I wanted to start closing it out. Thank you so much, Stephanie, for hopping on and doing Ask a Scientist with me. I wanted to give you this opportunity if there's anything that you wanted to shout out to anyone, or if you wanted to include any SFPI social media. Now's the time.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me on. This has been really fun. And let's see, SFEI is on Facebook and LinkedIn and Twitter, so you can find us in those three places. I think the main place is probably, oh, there goes, there goes my setup at the very end. Um, the main place is probably to go to Twitter, which is at SFEI underscore ASC.
Cool, awesome. And similarly, SFEP, or the SF Estuary Partnership, we're on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We hope to be on LinkedIn soon. Um, just a reminder that we are doing Ask a Scientist usually on select Fridays this fall, so keep on tuning in. We may have actually a special spooky surprise coming in the next couple of weeks. And yeah, if you feel so inclined or inspired or motivated by our conversation today, I highly encourage you to check the link in SFEP's bio in Instagram. Um, we are looking for public input for the estuary blueprint. I mentioned before that this is the roadmap to a healthier, better estuary by 2050, and we want to hear from regular folks just like you. So pop into the bio, click on that link, click take a survey, and help us out. All right.
Great.
Okay. Well, thanks.
Thanks so much. Thanks for joining, everybody.
Yeah, thanks for joining. All right. Take care. Have a good Friday.
Bye.